Hello, you're watching TRANSBRATIONS. I'm nahshondion. In honor and celebration of Black History Month, my first special guest is Secretary Shirley Weber, a native of Hope, Arkansas, and an academic and politician nominated to serve as the 31st California Secretary of State by Governor Gavin Newsom on December 22nd, 2020, and sworn into office on January 29, 2021. She's California's first Black Secretary of State and only the 5th African American to serve as a state constitutional officer in California's 170-year history. Secretary Weber was previously a member of the California State Assembly for the 79th Assembly District, which includes portions of San Diego County. As a member of the California Legislative Black Caucus, she was the first African American to be elected to the California State Legislature south of Los Angeles. While Secretary Weber was an Assembly member, she authored AB 3121, a historical bill approved by Governor Gavin Newsom in May of 2020, and established a 9-member task force to inform Californians about slavery and to explore ways the state might provide reparations for slavery to African Americans. Secretary Weber is a powerful voice for justice who has dedicated her career to defending and strengthening our most fundamental civil rights, including the right to vote. In a time of unprecedented partisan attacks on our democracy, Secretary Weber is standing firm, standing straight, and standing strong to protect, secure, and expand California's right to vote. Hello, Secretary Weber. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. This is Black History Month. You are my first guest. It is an honor. I'm honored to have you here with me. Regarding the task force, there's 9 members, and Camila Moore is the chairperson of the task force. And I had went to Harvard on November the 3rd. She was giving a speech. She was giving a keynote speech. It was a symposium. I'm sorry. It was called "Can Reparations Close the Racial Health Gap?" I was able to meet her. I met her mother, had lunch with her, and I was surprised to learn that she lives in Pasadena and that she's lived there since 2010. And her mother lives in Altadena. I had been reading about her. Obviously, I knew who she was, and I went specifically because I wanted to hear her keynote speech. I hadn't read anywhere that she lived in Pasadena. You know, I know she's not from there, but I hadn't read that in any media information about her. So that was really surprising. During her speech, she had called us by our names: Fula, Hausa, Mandinka, Yoruba, San, Kanuri, Akan, Masai, Asante, Dogon, Wolof, Igbo, Songhai, Hoisin, and Himba. And people had started crying. Camila, she had choked back tears as she discussed her ancestors who were slaves on the Whitney Plantation in Louisiana and those who lived in Chatham, Mississippi. And we were talking later, and she had said that when she wrote her speech, she didn't think she would cry. And I told her I didn't think I would either, but I did. I was really happy to be able to go there and to be in that environment and to be a part of something like that, especially at Harvard. That was a big deal for me.
Now that everyone is on the same page about the legislative history, logistics, and the work product of our task force, I will officially begin the substance of my closing remarks. Wolof, Bambana, Bambara, Nar, Moor, Pulard, Phobi, Mandinga, Kisi, Kanga, Chamba, Phone, Hausa, Nago, Edo, Calabar, Ibibio, Congo, Makwa, Arada, Moko, Dindi, Jaba, Mina, Ewe, Nupe, Igbo, Yoruba, Fulani, Hausa, Bubi, Malagasy. According to the Whitney Plantation Museum in La Place, Louisiana, those are some of the indigenous African ethnicities of which members were bartered and sold as human cargo from the great and exploited continent known as Africa, as the late Martin Luther King Jr. once said, to the colony of Louisiana. Through sheer terror and violence, European enslavers attempted to strip these indigenous African human beings of their cultural and ethnic heritages, relying on the power to label them Negro, to label them Black, to label them mulatto, or other socially constructed terms to deny them of their human right to self-determination. These vestiges of descent-based chattel slavery that mar my own family's history in the United States traveled with us to California through the Great Migrations. Like my father's ancestors, who were actually once enslaved on the Whitney Plantation, formerly known as the German-owned habitation Heidel. And my mother's ancestors, namely my grandmother and great-grandmother Catherine Young and Viola Cooper, who were subjected to slavery by another name, known as sharecropping, in Chula, Mississippi, which to this day, since they left Mississippi in the 1930s, remains the poorest town and the poorest state in the nation. These mighty women were internal refugees, twice trekking from Chula, Mississippi to Los Angeles to escape casteist terror in the Deep South, only to be met by Jim Crow again, only this time out west. As the esteemed Ta-Nehisi Coates once wrote, never forget that we were enslaved in this country longer than we have been free. Chattel slavery, sharecropping, convict leasing, de jure and de facto segregation, redlining, educational funding discrepancies, predatory financial practices, unfair labor practices, chronic unemployment and underemployment, medical experimentation, sterilization, intellectual property deprivation, environmental terror, family separation, police brutality, anti-Black hate crimes, vigilante violence, extrajudicial terror, the war on drugs, mass incarceration, over-policing, unfair sentencing, the school-to-prison pipeline, extreme poverty, homelessness, gentrification, health harms, no generational wealth. These are just a sampling of the atrocities exacted against the African American community since our ancestors first stepped their shackled feet on American soil in 1619. In our chapter on mental and physical harm and neglect, we highlighted that enslavement is, at least in part, responsible for the fact that African Americans have had the worst health care, health status, and health outcomes of any racial, ethnic, or political group in the United States. In all, the health disparities that exist today between European Americans and African Americans are directly connected to the institution of slavery. And I will use two pictures from our interim report to further illustrate the following points. Physicians used enslaved people for dangerous experimental surgeries and procedures without repercussion, and federal, state, and local governments used the law to further damage the health of enslaved people and dehumanize them while neglecting to provide public health and healthcare services. Also, white enslavers tortured enslaved people, openly inflicting cruel punishment upon them without legal consequences, and permanently damaged their physical and mental health. To the right of me is a picture of an enslaved man named Wilson Chin. This is from the 12th chapter in our interim report on mental and physical harm and neglect. Wilson Chin was branded with the initials of his enslaver on his forehead. Chin is also wearing a punishment collar and posing with other equipment used to punish slaves. And that was in 1863. I would be remiss to say we are also at Harvard University, who also has its own role in perpetuating slavery. And I would share the picture of Papa Renti, but out of respect of Tamara Lanier, I will not. But I will say free Renti. Also in the 1880s and 90s, public health agencies claimed that African Americans had naturally weaker immune systems and irregular habits were the reason so many African Americans died, rather than inadequate access to sanitation, drinking water, food, and overcrowded housing due to racial segregation. During congressional debates over the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau, a program which included government-funded health care for newly freed African Americans, white legislators argued that assistance to free Black people would result in dependence. The fifth point is that medical experimentations did not end with enslavement, and then I'll show another picture. Here is a picture of students, medical students at that, at the University of Maryland School of Medicine in 1898. This is courtesy of the book Dissection, Photographs of a Rite of Passage in American Medicine, 1880 to 1930, page 101. These students at the University of Maryland School of Medicine are dissecting a Black woman, an African-American woman. The English sociologist Harriet Martineau wrote in 1838 that the bodies of colored people exclusively are taken for dissection because the whites do not like it and the colored people cannot resist. If you look at the side of that table, read what is etched. It says, "Her loss is our gain." You can take the picture off.
Going back to the task force, in 2021, they had received testimony about segregation, redlining, voter restrictions, other forms of discrimination, and they had discussed whether it was appropriate to pay reparations to all African Americans in California or only those ancestors who were enslaved. And the committee was presented with calculations for certain scenarios, including figures amounting to hundreds of thousands of dollars in reparations for each California resident who could prove they are descendants of enslaved persons. And at that point, that's when it was established that it would be reparations would be lineage based.
You're right. Yeah. That was important. That was an important decision to be made. And because, I mean, you could get to, because the argument is that there was harm done, intergenerational harm done to those whose parents had been enslaved, wherever they'd been, even in the South and been moved to California, whatever, that the psychic of a person is so damaged as a result of the onslaught of racism against them as because they had been slaves. And it was interesting because some folks felt like, well, every Black person is somewhat impacted. That is true, but not in the same sense as others, because you have folks who come here from, my son-in-law's from Kenya, and his parents still own lots of land in Kenya, and they are part of the Kikuyus, and they have this and have that. And even though they're here, they now see that there was some discriminatory practices, but they're psychic, that they know who they are, they know where they came from, they know where their relatives are, they know what tribe they were part of. They still have the connections that most of us don't have and can't have, because those connections were severed in slavery. So, when you see that and you see the impact, it clearly says that slavery has had an impact, and you can't just, it's like the Asians who lost their property during World War II. Asians today, the young people know about it, but they did not have the same level of impact as those who had actually been in those concentration camps. And so to say, well, every Asian has been impacted, you are through some other means, but it's not the same. And you're trying to remedy a situation, and you're not doing it based on race. You're doing it based on damage that was done, and that's a different kind of thing. It's to say someone came here from who was raised in Russia and comes to the United States and they're Black. Their world, if you talk to them, their world is very, very different, very different than those who were here in the United States. And I've talked to Africans and various individuals around the world, and their view of race sometimes is very different until they're confronted with racism. And then even then, their response is very different. And the fact that they still can go home and they still have sovereignty somewhere else is extremely important to them. So if we're going to do reparations, it has to be based on the harm that has been done, and it can be traced intergenerationally. You just can't give it to everybody, because then people take their reparations and go somewhere else and what have you, simply because they were standing over here when they were passing out checks or something of that nature. And we're not going. And so it really has to address the harm. Otherwise, you fall into the trap of Prop 209, and you can't have race-based issues in California, but you can't have harm-based.
I was going to say, Secretary Weber, I was going to say they'll take their reparations and go start another country.
Probably.
Yeah.
The prevailing narrative is that California entered the Union as a free state and that Jim Crow and racism never existed here. But a year-long examination that included expert testimony and history records by the California Reparations Task Force exposed that narrative as a myth.
those dominant narratives have been pretty much altogether dispelled, right? We learned very early on in the process that California did have slavery in the state. We've learned early on in the process that Jim Crow did exist in California.
Moore says that reality didn't just impact African Americans in the past. Its devastating consequences continue into the present day through laws, policies, and institutions. The task force calls them badges of slavery, and Moore says they pervade every sector of civil society.
We outlined, racial terror, separate and unequal education, political disenfranchisement, housing segregation, racism in environment and infrastructure, the pathologizing of the Black family, control over creative, cultural, and intellectual life, stolen labor and hindered opportunity, an unjust legal system, mental and physical harm and neglect, and then lastly, the wealth gap.
The report outlines numerous recommendations to help repair slavery's damage and the lingering effects on Black Americans. Proposals include free health care and interest-free home loans. The task force is also proposing that California create an agency to support genealogical research to help people confirm their eligibility for reparations. To qualify, a person must be a descendant of an enslaved Black person or of a free Black person living in the U.S. before the end of the 19th century. Dr. Evelyn McDowell, whose testimony led to some of the proposals around eligibility, says genealogical research is also key to true self-knowledge.
It is extremely important for yourself, for your own self-love, to know who you are and where you came from so you can identify how you fit in the history of this country. So I just think it's a good thing for us individually to do. It's a good thing for our country to do. How are we ever going to heal from this history of slavery?
Economists say any meaningful healing must include a commitment by the federal government to fix the nationwide wealth gap at an estimated cost of $14 trillion. And that's not all. In addition, they estimate the debt owed for the stolen labor through the enslavement of Black people alone is a little over $6 quadrillion. Jade Hindman, KPBS News.
I was at that meeting on November the 3rd at Harvard. Camila had said, in California, Black Americans may soon be eligible for up to $1 million in reparations. I hope others look to California as we trailblaze what reparations look like for Black Americans who descended from those who lived in slavery. And that's something that I never thought I would hear before.
The task force also held two-day hearings earlier this year on the intersection of reparations for African Americans and mental, physical, and public health. We invited experts like Dr. Joan Kaufman, who in a report with Cobra provided expert testimony on the concept of transgenerational epigenetic inheritance, which describes how the negative effects of adversities and traumas in one generation can be passed down to affect the health and well-being of future generations, and how grandchildren and great-grandchildren can be negatively impacted by ancestral traumas, even when they have not been directly exposed to harm themselves. This results not only in mental and substance abuse disorders linked to trauma, but also to an increased risk of other health problems, including cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. Also, most notably, at our most recent hearing in September in Los Angeles at the California Science Center, the economic consultant team, one of which comprises of Dr. Darity, who is the speaker today. He's a part of our team that we hired to begin figuring out what does compensation look like for particular state-sanctioned atrocities, including but not limited to devaluation of African-American businesses, over-policing and mass incarceration, housing discrimination and houselessness, unjust property takings, and lastly, health harms. So for instance, in September, The Economist took into account data that demonstrates that, for one, there are statistics to show that the value of statistical life is roughly around $9 million to $11 million. And two, there is a 7.6-year life expectancy gap between white Californians and African American Californians. That, of course, cannot be explained away by inherent differences, but rather is a direct result of intentional genocidal policy enacted against the enslaved and their descendants. Thus, the economists have proposed that African American Californians who descend from slaves are owed $127,226 per year of life expectancy. So that could mean very well by the end of our process, the California State Legislators put our policies into law, that African American Californians who have spent their entire lives in California could be entitled to reparations for state-sanctioned health harms in the amount of $966,000 and $921, or nearly $1 million, excuse me. As I give these closing remarks, African American or American freedmen Californians are resiliently surviving the afterlife of descent-based chattel slavery. In fact, African Americans have been historically burdened with confronting the aforementioned lingering badges and incidents of slavery without significant government aid or private action, particularly since the broken promise of Reconstruction in this country and the unjust dismantling of the Freedmen's Bureau in 1872 that accompanied it. Thus, it is my hope that the work of the task force reinvigorates the African American community to exercise our human right to self-determination with the renewed energy that enables us to freely determine our status in this country and to pursue our economic, social, and cultural development via comprehensive reparatory justice policies. In addition, the California Reparations Task Force will most likely sunset during the International Decade for People of African Descent, which is from 2015 to 2024, proclaimed by the UN General Assembly. Thus, it is also my hope that the task force overall efforts strengthen the movement for global reparatory justice for people of African descent. In fact, earlier this year, CARICOM, a Federation of Caribbean nations, and the African Union organized a conference to re-engage European nations on the unresolved issue of reparations for their respective regions. The task force interim report also highlights the unjust treatment of many other groups in California, from Native, Latinx, Asian, and African Black diasporic communities, and other marginalized groups. Thus, it is also my hope that the information in our interim report empowers these groups in their respective advocacy efforts, and not only that, strengthens the capacity for cross-cultural allyship and movement building. Most notably, as I conclude, I hope that municipalities or other states, and most importantly, the federal government, looks to the state of California as we trailblaze in setting precedent for what reparatory and transitional justice looks like for African Americans who are descendants of slaves. And every day, as the task force meets its sunset in July, we get one step closer in making reparations a reality. And so on behalf of the California Reparations Task Force, we thank you, I thank you, for partnering with us in this journey. Thank you.
So a month later, December the 1st, every day, every week, it's getting more media attention and the public is becoming more aware of, what's going on in California. So December the 1st, various news reports had said Gavin Newsom's reparations committee will recommend handing out $223,000 per person to all descendants of slaves in California for housing discrimination, costing $559 billion, the nation's biggest restitution effort ever. The next day, Camila Moore, the chair of the California Reparations Task Force, she had tweeted, "The headline is misleading. We haven't officially recommended anything. These are calculations given to us by the economists that we hired."
Well, that's true. There hasn't been a recommendation of any amount of money yet individually that's there, and I'm not even sure if people want to make a contribution of financial base. So, but when they asked the economist, if you had to make restitution for what happened with redlining and property, they look at the number of folks that were impacted by redlining and the policies of California and say, hey, if we had to basically go to court and say you disenfranchise all these people through redlining, what would that look like? And they basically said it would be some odd $1 million award to each person who's had some redlining experience. That doesn't mean that's the recommendation of the commission. That was somebody, if you ask, this is to give people some information so that if someone says, well, I don't think they deserve more than $5,000. Well, that is a long way from 250,000. I mean, a long way. And so this was basically to add some meat to the discussion, because people were asking the question, well, how much would it do? What can we do? What are we, what is there? And so to help people understand the size of the problem for 400 years, when you've denied somebody something that long, what's the restitution for it? What do you get in return for it? And so this is something that is not going to be easy to do. It's going to take a lot of time, but the commission thus far has not come up with an amount.
Right.
Right. But they may come up with some goals and objectives. They may come up with some endowments that have been established and some policies and those kinds of things to begin to address the things. What do you do for people who've lived in this country forever and never owned property, never had a chance to own a piece of property in California, and have constantly been redlined and turned away from this, that, and the other, and resources. There was, I guess, a recent case that was discovered and ruled on that with regards to redlining and property that was taken and opportunities that were taken from folks across the country. So people are looking at this because these were policies. This is not something that some man standing on a corner decided he didn't want to do something. These are direct policies that were established by various governments and municipalities that denied Black people access to resources and gave it to other people who could use it to amass wealth. And we were denied that opportunity to do that.
And I know that there's also talk that possibility that it could be non-cash payments for reparations. Reparations could come in different forms.
Multitude of forms. Yes.
Multitude of forms.
Today in the United States, a huge wealth gap and a huge health gap divide Black and white communities. Let's zoom in on one representative city, Boston. The median net worth of white households in 2015 was almost $250,000. For non-immigrant Black families, $8. In parts of the wealthy, mostly white neighborhood of Back Bay, life expectancy approaches 90 years. In parts of Roxbury, a mostly Black neighborhood just a few miles away, life expectancy is closer to 60 years. This isn't just a Boston problem. Throughout the nation's history, Black people have lived shorter lives and had worse health than white Americans. How did we get here? It's due to structural racism. For centuries, racism has been embedded in our economy and society, produced and reproduced by laws and practices sanctioned and implemented by government. The legacy of the slave trade, when Africans were sold, beaten, raped, torn from their families, exploited and uncompensated for hundreds of years, followed by a long reign of terror, and coupled with our long history of segregation and disinvestment, has directly harmed health and inequitably shaped opportunities. Discriminatory policies have prevented Black people from buying homes in well-resourced neighborhoods, from taking out loans to start their own businesses, from having access to good schools and colleges, from advancing in the workplace. Structural racism contributes to the lack of green space and the pollution that far too often chokes Black neighborhoods, to police brutality and repression, to our unjust legal system, to the limited access to nutritious foods and quality healthcare in Black communities. How can we begin to redress these long-standing harms? One potential path is reparations, designed to compensate people and communities damaged by injustice. In the U.S., Policymakers at the local, state, and federal levels are considering reparations for descendants of those enslaved and other Black people. Reparations could take the form of direct cash payments to individuals paired with investments in Black communities. The focus is often on closing the racial wealth gap, but reparations could significantly narrow the racial health gap. Reparations could give Black families access to resources that are critical to well-being, but that have long been denied to Black people. Resources like better neighborhoods, better schools, more green space, and clean air. And by allowing Black families to pass on wealth to their children, reparations, along with race-conscious policies that actively work to dismantle structural racism, could break the cycle of intergenerational poverty and poor health. This is the moment for the health community and those already working on health equity to join the conversation around reparations. We must be at the table to close the health gap and correct centuries of injustice.
There was a situation in October with the LA City Council. Nuri Martinez, she was the president of the LA City Council. It was her, a union leader. They had conversations involved racist and disparaging comments. Audio recording was captured between the former City Council President Nuri Martinez and fellow council members Gil Cedillo and Kevin De Leon, and the LA County Federation of Labor President Ron Herrera. Over the past few months, Black LA residents have been dealing with increased anti-Blackness, the LA City Council member scandal, and KDL, who will not resign, even at the urging of President Biden to resign. To me, it's a current example of why we seek reparations and why we deserve reparations. As a California lawmaker, what kind of legislation would you propose? Is there legislation that you could propose as an effective way to remove disruptive racist politicians like KDL from public office and bar them from serving in the future?
It's difficult because you can't even, sexual harassment, even with those laws, you can't remove people unless they've been convicted of something. And most folks would have resigned, but KDL doesn't have the same level of moral compass that most people have. The other person did resign, and he probably should resign. And Sadia is out of office, I think, or will be out soon. So
yeah.
Insisted, which gives you a peep into his personality and those kinds of things, that to insist that you're going to continue to serve when you've demonstrated that that you're tainted. His colleagues, I understand, have censored him, and he can't serve on various committees or something of that. So it would be nice to be able to do that. The challenge is that, of going to court and proving that somebody has done something, that just because they have a perspective that is there, it's up to his constituents to remove him from office. And they have the tools to do that if they choose to. They can remove him by impeachment. Various kinds of things that are there, and they've done that impeachment with different individuals. They can remove him for that. And so there's a way to get rid of a person, but oftentimes it revolves around the constituents. And you tread lightly on that, because the same way that you develop something to get rid of somebody you don't like, somebody will develop the same policy to get rid of somebody you like. So you want to. There is a way to do it. They can impeach him. And LA can basically decide not to acknowledge him and to allow him to serve on committees, which I think they've done that. And his community should see that he's been stripped of any influence and power. And so they probably should remove him from office, and they can do that if they choose to. Yeah.
Hate crimes have surged in LA County in 2021 to their highest level since 2002, according to a report by County Commission on Human Relations. The report noted 786 victims of hate crimes, 23% increase over 2020. Crimes overwhelmingly included acts of violence, more than half spurred by racism towards Blacks, Latinos, Jews, LGBTQ individuals. Those were the most targeted groups. Many African Americans are upset and disappointed to continue to be overlooked for loans and funding to start and to sustain businesses, while some immigrants seem to fare better in that regard. Many younger African Americans are also disillusioned and no longer believe in or support the Democratic Party. What do you say to young African Americans who feel and believe that our interests are being ignored and overlooked, leaving us as third-class citizens?
The way you make your wishes known is that you have to be present and accountable and active and basically fighting back. life has never been easy for us. I mean, King could have sat down and said, oh, well, you know, these folks are not going to be fair. And we, you know, somebody else should have done it. My grandfather should have done it. Somebody else, you know, and yet you realize that in the end, it's basically you that needs to do that. Who we're waiting for to do these things is you. People are doing things, but are you engaged? Are you involved? Are you willing to basically fight the battle to get it done? And that is extremely important that we do that. And we have to believe that nobody's going to fight this battle for us but us. You know, the fact that it's nice to have people who are allies and supporters, but in the end, you know, you're the ones affected. You're the ones with the challenge that's there. And we have to hold ourselves accountable and fight back with every a moment of breath that we have to get the things we want done. So, you know, it's a difficult situation, you know, when you're in the midst of a struggle and but if you look around, there's nobody here to do this but us. You know, we can talk about other people. Over the years, if there's something wrong, my attitude is, well, if not me, then who? Let me get up and get this done, because I can sit here and bitch, moan, and groan and end up with nothing in the end, but a whole bunch of people mad and angry. Or we can start trying to make change. We can try to make change by changing what we do and supporting the people who are making change. That is critically important. Voting is extremely important. I tell people all the time when they start talking to me about, well, we need more elected officials like you. I said, then you need to vote. You need to go find these people to run for office, and you need to put your money and your time into it so that they can win the office. That's how you make change. Not by complaining about folks and not by having someone else create your freedom. Your freedom is yours. And we have to be able to be there to fight those battles. And if others join us, that's fine. But the bottom line is I'm fighting for my grandkids, for your grandkids, for everybody else. And the responsibility is ours. You know, it will not be an easy thing to do. And I think sometimes we look and think, well, it should be easier. Well, I always tell folks, you know, you think about King and he made the ultimate sacrifice. So many others did too. So, you know, it's our time and our moment to really raise the issues that are critical for us to deal with, period. There's nobody here but us, for us, and we need to do it.
As other states attempt to roll back voting rights, Secretary Weber has used her office to protect and expand the freedom to vote here in California and across the country, said Equality California Executive Director Tony Hoang. LGBTQ Californians are lucky to have such a dedicated partner in the Secretary of State's office. Throughout her career, Secretary Weber has been a committed ally and a champion for full lived equality, and we look forward to helping elect her to a full term this November. On November the 8th, make sure you vote to re-elect Dr. Weber for California Secretary of State. You won a full term in the 2022 election. This was your second term, and your two top priorities you had mentioned were continuing registration, implementing strong elections, and supporting businesses and nonprofits better, and to increase voter registration. And you had mentioned that you don't understand why everyone doesn't vote, trying to grow younger voters age 18 to 25 and help them understand why their vote is so powerful and necessary, which goes into what you had just previously mentioned, but I just wanted to make that comment. So in several interviews before, you've mentioned that you've often been the only African-American in the room. What advice do you have for other African-American younger people moving up in the professional world? What advice would you give them when they find themselves in that position?
Well, you know, there are a lot of things in terms of people need to learn and know how to stay in power, how to stay in positions by being competent, hardworking, so forth and so on. Always recognize that the potential for somebody to upend you is always there and present. So don't go to sleep on the job, basically, handle business. But in addition to that, always open up opportunities for others. You know, some of us are happy to be the only something. And when I took office in 2012, I said, I may be the first African-American in the legislature from San Diego, but I will not be the last. And immediately we began to work. So my daughter has taken my seat. We've got another African-American woman in city council. We've got some that are mayors of various cities. We have put together through our efforts a support system for African Americans to run for political office, and others have done likewise.
There is a certificate of election from the Secretary of State at the Assembly desk. The clerk will read the certificate of election.
I, Shirley Weber, PhD, Secretary of State of the State of California, hereby certify that according to information concerning the statement of the results of the special primary election held on April 6, 2021 on file in my office, Akila Weber was elected to the office of State Assembly Member, District 79. In witness whereof, I hereunto set my hand and affix the great seal of the state of California at Sacramento on this day, April 15th, 2021. Shirley Weber, PhD, Secretary of State.
Without objection, the certificate of election is ordered printed in the journal. Assemblymember-elect Akilah Weber will now take the oath of office. As Speaker of the Assembly, it is my privilege to introduce a special guest for the administration of the oath. She is a former member of this House who is held in great esteem. She is also the mother of Dr. Akilah Weber. Today is historic. It is the first time a mother who is a statewide officer has sworn in a daughter for state legislative office in California history. We are very, very proud to welcome back California Secretary of State, the Honorable Dr. Shirley Nash Weber. Secretary Weber.
Thank you. Thank you. I cannot thank you enough for this moment. And as a mother, as a legislator, I am so excited about being back with you here today and leaving you one of my best, one of my children. I want to thank the Speaker, Mr. Speaker, and members for granting me this privilege of doing this. I've said consistently to my daughter as we take the oath of office that be careful to read what it says, because in many cases we don't really realize what we're saying. But what we are saying very clearly is that oftentimes you are the first, the last, and sometimes the only defense of democracy against tyranny. And we take that oath very seriously, and she's joining the 79 of you to make sure that this democracy remains a democracy for all of California. And so I'm honored today as an elected official, statewide officer, but also as a mom, to be able to swear in Dr. Akilah Weber and her family that's with us, my grandsons and her husband. Akilah, will you raise your right hand? I, and state your name,
I, Akilah Weber,
do solemnly swear
do solemnly swear
that I will support and defend
that I will support and defend
the Constitution of the United States
the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California
and the Constitution of the State of California
against all enemies,
against all enemies,
foreign and domestic,
foreign and domestic,
and that I will bear true faith
and that I will bear true faith
and allegiance
and allegiance
to the Constitution of the United States
to the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California,
and the Constitution of the State of California,
that I take this obligation freely
that I take this obligation freely
without any mental reservation
without any mental reservation
or purpose of evasion,
or purpose of evasion,
and that I will well
and that I will well
and faithfully
discharge
the duties
the duties
upon which I am about to enter.
upon which I am about to enter.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So even though we get to these positions and we're the only one in the room, we also want to make sure that others come in the room with us. So when I've been in positions like organizations where the only Black person in the room was, I was the only person there, the next time they had a meeting, there were 3 of us, and there was 4 of us, and there was 5 of us. And sometimes I paid those people's dues so they could be in the room. I mean, we have to bring people along and help them to understand, because sometimes they don't even know these organizations exist. They don't even know their room is in the building, So we have to open up, and I do that. I always bring people with me to the meeting, whether it's young people or older folks. I want them to see where the power is and what they need to do to get some of that power.
Bring a whole busload.
That's right. Bring everybody who will come to the party, because it is really important to do that. And I've done that with the Democratic Party, where when we had to elect representatives in the 79th district, I organized these women. They got together. I said, now, if you're going to do it, you got to do it right. And they shocked the rest of them, because there's only 14 positions in the ADEM, was what they call them, the advisory committee. And of those 14 in our district, 12 of them turned out to be African Americans. They organized, they put their stuff, and people were shocked because there was such a huge turnout of people to vote for ADMs. And we had always ignored those positions. And yet those are positions of power that determine the policy of the Democratic Party. So if you feel that the Democratic Party is not responding to your issue, going to the Republican Party is not the answer, because they're not going to respond at all. But what you need to do is take over those positions in the Democratic Party, making sure that the issues of African Americans are addressed in the party on a regular basis.
You've previously mentioned your love of Black History Month. I like to listen. I like to learn. I like to listen. I like to learn. Why is it important for us to celebrate Black History Month and to honor the achievements of African Americans?
Well, I think it's important to have Black History Month every month in all of our schools and those places, because when you don't know who you are, anybody can tell you who you are and you'll believe it. Know your history. You know the good, the bad, and all in between. You then are empowered to influence and make the history yourself. It is important for me to know that my father fought back at the way station, even though I was a little kid, because now I began to understand the kind of person he was and why he didn't want us to back down on certain issues and why he was adamant about having our own sense of self. If you don't know that, then you believe what everybody else says, that your father didn't go to school because he wasn't smart and and y'all, those kinds of things. You don't want to be anything, blah, blah, blah. But you need to understand why he didn't go beyond the 6th grade, because they wouldn't let him. You need to understand the difficulty he faced and his commitment to his children. So knowing your history empowers you.
Yes.
And every time I go to Black History Month, I learn something new about Black folks. Every time I go to the continent of Africa, I get a greater sense of identity and hopefully understanding of what the challenges were on the continent, so that I'm not just taking somebody else's word for it, but I see it, I feel it, I know what it is. And so I encourage people to know who you are. Find out the good, the bad, and ugly, not just on the surface, but really in a sense to understand what our folks have done and what they've been through. And the fact that we are here 40 years later is really a miracle, because everything that has been done has been designed to stop us from being here, to basically, same is true of Native American. All the efforts were to basically annihilate the people. And yet they stood and still stand today. And so, which talks about the resilience and the power of folks who, despite what they met with opposition, have still taken their nothing and made something. And that in itself should make every Black person extremely proud and able to basically move forward and accomplish anything they choose to accomplish.
And what happened with your project in West Africa and
In Jashi, I've been in West Africa since I've been in office. I still have a vision of building my house up in Jashi.
Okay.
No point in building a house if I'm not going to spend time there. I mean, if you build a house, you want to spend half of your life in Jashi and half in the United States. That was my original goal.
Okay.
But I'm going back hopefully to Ghana this year. I'll check to see if my friend is still there, the chief of Jashi. And I still have a dream to build a house in West Africa. Even if I don't get a chance to stay there much, maybe my grandkids will.
Earlier, you had mentioned that when with roots, people were tracing their, everything. So now with, reparations, Alex Haley, everybody had ran out and started to doing that. So now I think, with you creating AB 3121, that more people may be inclined to research their history, which is really, really great. So this coming June, July, the California Reparations Task Force, the 9-member Reparations Task Force Chair Camila Moore is going to release the report to Governor Gavin Newsom and you. Well, it'll be released to the legislature.
Right, it'll be released to the legislature. I probably will have access to it as well.
And so at some point, you're talking about, bringing folks to the party and stuff. At some point, is there going to be a big party?
I have no idea what they're going to do. We will probably be so happy to get the report and see if we can get the support from the legislature. But I don't know. I don't know if a party is warranted. People want results. Black folks can always give a party, so we know how to do that. But whether or not we're going to get the results we want from the legislature in terms of programs, it just makes it the next phase of the struggle. So we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens.
So I never ever thought there was a cap on what the Webers as a team or individually could achieve or accomplish. Do you remember who said that?
I may have said it. I don't know who could have said
No,
it.
you couldn't have. Well, no, I never ever thought there was a cap on what the Webers as a team or individually could achieve or accomplish. Willie Brown said they were both God-given talent-wise.
Okay, my good friend Willie. Yeah, he was a strong supporter of my husband, and he's a very amazing supporter of me. Yeah, he really has. So
Your husband, who was a lawyer and a judge.
yes, I'm honored. My husband was a lawyer and a judge. So I'm honored that Willie Brown would say that, because he has accomplished so much. And yet he sees what I do every day and says it's amazing. And I appreciate that.
And I was surprised to find out that he was the one who got Gavin Newsom involved in politics, or Gavin Newsom started working for him when he entered politics.
Yeah, yeah.
So that made a lot of sense to me. So yeah.
Somewhat by Willie, and they're still good friends. Yeah.
Secretary Weber, thank you for kicking off Black History Month with me and my audience. Thank you. Pardon me.
I said thank you for the opportunity to be with you.
Thank you for breaking barriers down, helping women run for office, being a champion for civil rights, equality, reparations, and police reform, and for creating AB 392, for creating AB 953, for creating AB 3121, and for creating hope for millions of African Americans in California and the USA. And last, thank you for your decades of public service, unimpeachable integrity, and moral clarity. Thank you, Secretary Weber.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. You take care.
Bye-bye.